We have here today Dambisa Moyo. She's written this very interesting book, very controversial book, and we just want to ask her a few questions about why she decided to write this. I've seen your very impressive CV. You've been to all the great schools in the world, you know, Harvard, I think Oxford, and so somebody told me that you've had a fair share of aid by way of scholarship. Otherwise, you couldn't have been Dambisa. So why now decide that aid is bad for the rest of Africa?
That's a brilliant point, but that's not aid, because there's an expectation that you write examinations and you pass a course. So aid, unlike the scholarship that you've just suggested, is actually free money. The expectation that our governments and as individuals we actually do something in return for that money, is actually not the case. So the scholarship is not aid, I'm afraid to say. It's something completely different. I would view it much more as investment. All
right, so the aid you are talking about, describe it to that ordinary African citizen, an ordinary American citizen. Describe it.
Okay, so in the book, I talk about three types of aid. There's what we call humanitarian or emergency aid. So, for example, if there were a tsunami or Katrina, so floods or an earthquake, I think as a global society, we can argue the humanitarian and moral imperative of us actually intervening and getting involved. This book does not deal with humanitarian or emergency aid. The second type of aid is NGO or charitable aid. Just to give you an example, that would kind of be like you and I perhaps making a donation towards a scholarship program that you alluded to for a young girl in Zambia to go to school. Again, the book is not talking about that type of aid. This book is about the third type of aid, which is the large billion-dollar packages of government-to-government transfers, but also multilateral to government transfers that have been going on for about 60 years to Africa. But by my estimates from World Bank and IMF data, is over $1 trillion of aid has gone to Africa. And that's the aid that I'm criticizing here.
You have not, in my view, and in view of some of the people who have sent us questions before now, criticized the process of, say, giving out loans to African leaders that, you know, have brought Africa down. Why is he not talking about aid, for example? Why are you not asking for the pulling down of the World Bank, for example, because of the failures of their policies in Africa as opposed to aid?
That's actually not correct, because in the book I do on many occasions argue that in particular the World Bank and IMF, I would argue that the problem is not that they don't understand what should be done in Africa. I think they just have not been aggressive enough in implementing some of the policies. So let me give you some examples. In the 1980s, a lot of aid went towards what's called structural adjustment programs and stabilization programs, and really towards promoting free trade, privatization, many of the things that I'm talking about in the second half of the book, which are, I'm arguing, are better ways of financing economic development. So I believe that those institutions are correct in that model of economic development and development financing, but they don't go far enough. They continue, although in a sense giving it lip service, so they continue to perpetuate an aid-based model rather than actually forcing African governments to start to wean themselves off of aid money and to pursue other ways of financing development.
So your recommendation, according to your book, is for them to go into the bond market, for example.
For example.
Yes, and take out money, and that's in your own view, the bond market allows for discipline.
Absolutely.
Because you take money, you have to pay back. It's punitive if you don't. But how do you recommend a glutinous, primitive African leader to pay back short, punitive loans when they cannot manage it? And I use the word a glutinous African leader. For example, I can say Mobutu Sese Seko is glutinous. That Sani Abacha is glutinous because these guys told their countries blind. And we have evidence of it, so I'm not making that up.
The reason I believe that that type of leadership has been allowed or had been allowed to stay in power is because of the aid model. They were able to draw on a rent which basically facilitated what in economics they call rent seeking.
So, but then, how do you expect such African leaders to manage short-term bonds if they can't manage free money? You have also recommended in the book that probably you prefer what you called in the book, or what I've heard you say, benevolent dictatorship. You know, what does that mean? Well, can there be a dictatorship that is benevolent?
Well,
isn't that an oxymoron?
No, not at all. I mean, Asia's got very good examples of that, and I think the notion of a dictator conjures up very negative, very greedy leadership. But we've seen in places like in many countries in Asia where actually the governments are not necessarily elected officials, but actually have delivered long-term growth and development, and they alleviated poverty very dramatically. China is the obvious example. Singapore is another example, across much of Eastern Europe, but also in South America, for example. So my point there is not to say that democracy doesn't matter. I think ultimately we all would like to live in a democratic society, but you cannot and you will not get a democratic society unless you have a middle class that has a vested interest in actually seeing the economy grow, but also being able to hold the government accountable. And you can't get that in an aid model.
How do we grow the middle class in Africa? By your own model?
The second half of my book actually comes up specifically with prescriptions of what governments should be doing to replace the aid monies that they've been relying on, such as trade, and not trade with America or Europe, because the markets are largely closed off to African countries. They should focus on places like China, like India, that desperately need African foodstuff to feed their populations. China, for example, has got 1.3 billion people. It's got 7% arable land. It desperately needs to tap into Africa's ability to provide food. I talk about foreign direct investment. This is a way of attracting private capital flows, which are better, they're more transparent, they can hold the government more accountable. The only way you're going to get those type of flows is if foreign investors think that governments are transparent and that the environment is attractive for investment. In many African countries, some African countries, it takes 2 years to get a business license, which is completely absurd. And you wouldn't have that if governments were incentivized to grow the private sector. And you only get the incentive to grow the private sector if they're not relying on aid. I also talk about the bond market, which you've touched upon. I believe it's proven, not just in China and India, but also quite close to home, South Africa and Botswana. These are countries that are using the bond markets as a way of development finance. They don't rely on aid to the same extent that other African countries do. So it's no surprise that we've seen poverty levels and growth rates in these two countries.
What do you say about a country like Nigeria that doesn't really rely on aid, has a lot of oil, and yet there's a problem of poverty, there's a problem of mismanagement, the infrastructure is collapsed. Don't you think this actually is a leadership problem as opposed to the problem of aid?
It's virtually impossible to delink aid from bad leadership. In the book I say that aid makes good leaders bad and bad leaders worse. And why is that? Because it brings in incentives for bad behavior without penalty. So governments, even if they initially have the best intentions for their countries, they are able to get away without being held accountable. And so we live in this low-level equilibrium where donors are incentivized to lend to African governments despite showing no or very bad behavior.
Now, let's go back to private capital. You're advocating that Africans should lash on private capital from wherever they come from. We've seen Wall Street collapse in the US because of corruption. So, but you are saying now that we should still rely on this same kind of model, this raw capitalistic intervention. How do you look at your position on that and the situation of capitalism, say in the US? I mean, the collapse of the US as a result of this unrestricted control given to private capital to run a country like the US to the ground? Well,
I think, first of all, I would say it hasn't collapsed. I mean, it's still functioning. I think that's a bit extreme. But also, I'm going to basically paraphrase President Obama from his inauguration speech. Let's not be confused here that the free market system is still the best system for delivering wealth. What this crisis in the past 18 months has proven is that left unshackled or unfettered or unregulated, it can be problematic. But I think nobody is suggesting, and you can read even the harshest critics right now about what has happened, no one is suggesting that we should go to a socialist or a communistic system. The capitalistic model has delivered jobs across the world. And look at China, 300 million jobs and 300 million people moved into the middle class in our lifetime. And yet we're so, vociferously criticizing the capitalistic model.
Well, let's come back to the issue of what you are doing and which is out there. Some people criticize you that your model is a little bit shaky for the fact that it's also very attractive to the extreme right-wing figures in the West. Like Fox News, for example, will be happy that you're doing this because it's always said we're helping Africans too much. The Daily Mail in the UK, somebody said in their blogs, would love this, and the right-wing parties who had always wanted to do away with Africa as a problem or get away from the responsibility or the guilt of colonialization, that you are providing them a leeway. How do you respond to that?
The problem of Africa is not a right-wing or left-wing problem. It's a global problem. We should all care. We should all care, and we should all have this. I believe we all have the same goal. Whether you are heading the biggest charity or you're heading with the most right-wing organization, I believe we all want to see Africa stand on its own 2 feet and become an equal partner on the global stage. That being the case, should we not all, instead of splitting hairs about whether we're a Republican or Democrat or black or white or from Africa or not, should we not all look at the evidence and look at the logic and say what has in the past delivered the best route of growth? And if we look at it that way, we can say categorically that no country ever on earth has ever achieved long-term economic growth, and no country has ever reduced poverty by relying on aid. And we know that countries that have relied on aid have consistently shown poor records of economic performance. That's what I care about. I don't care about people quibbling about which side. We have the same goal, and we have evidence, and we have logic. And I believe that this book was not written to start a fight. It was to start a debate, a serious debate. We're 60 years into this model. At what point do we say enough? Are we going to say enough when it's 90% of African people are living on less than $1 a day? When every country has got, it looks like Somalia, where it's a failed state? At what point does the world say, hang on, enough? And that's what this book is about.
How do you place corporations in your own view? Because largely the continent of Africa has suffered in the hands of corporations, either individual corporations or large multinational corporations. And it seems that there's some kind of silence in your book on placing responsibility on the corporations, because they make the most money from the continent of Africa, from cocoa to oil to bauxite, copper. In fact, the African continent is partitioned on the basis of resources. Where do you place them? How are they missing in your radar?
They're not missing. I believe that everything emanates, and in this sense I'm quite a Keynesian. I believe that everything emanates from the responsibility of the government. The credit crisis is an example of this. If companies or banks, financial institutions are allowed to run roughshod without regulation, they'll do what is in their best interest. It's not unique to Africa. The problem, again, boils down to leadership, because if you have credible, accountable African leadership that is focused on making sure that Africans benefit from this situation, you won't have a problem of corporations gaining a reputation that you've suggested here. So it boils down to leadership. The question is very fundamental. How do we get African governments to behave in the best interest of African people? Because the day that we get that, we'll have no problems. And unfortunately, the aid model, by its very nature, means that the governments, by and large, are not incentivized to act on behalf of the African people.
China. You say you wanted to start a debate, but that's a fight over here. So how did you fall in love with China in view of the fact that this is a continent or a country, as a country that has suppressed human rights a lot? Is human rights also missing from your model?
No. Again, I believe things like human rights. Again, Africa has got a horrendous record of human rights. We don't have to wait for the Chinese to come in. We've had many of the biggest despots have ruled Africa. I strongly believe in the Chinese because their model is different to the aid model that has pervaded Africa for the past 60 years. Their model is one of business. They come in, they want to invest. Clearly, we do not want them to come into Africa carte blanche. But again, it's imperative that African governments force and focus on building those alliances, but also managing those alliances so that Africans can benefit. They're not going to do that in an aid model. And even in the worst case scenario, so let's take, people say, oh, but look at Sudan. If you go to Sudan and look at the infrastructure that's been built by the Chinese in the past 10 years, even with all the negativity around Sudan, it's unprecedented compared to many, many years of intervention from the West.
Well, I want to thank you very much for speaking with me, and we have here the audience and we'll take questions from the audience, because this is a citizen journalism model, by the way, where we, unlike CNN and the rest of them, have democratized the media. So if you don't mind, we'll take questions from the audience.
That's fine.
Hi. Lisa Vives from Global Information Network. You said something on the radio about the four horses of the apocalypse.
Yes.
And I'd like you to talk a little bit about media and how media has either helped or hindered African development.
I'm going to put media in the same camp as the celebrity culture, because I think that ultimately what emanates from that culture is incredibly problematic. And there's sort of three things I would say about it, and you're absolutely right. In the book I call the current situation what I call the four horsemen of Africa's apocalypse, which is basically war, corruption, disease, and poverty. And that's how we see Africa. You think Africa in your mind, that's what was one of those things, or all of those things. But the three things I have in terms of being problematic with the media currently, and also this whole celebrity culture, is, first of all, they're essentially wrong. They're promoting an aid model, which I've just articulated, I don't support. They are, rather than having a debate, they're basically looking for additional, up to $50 billion additional to be sent to Africa. So I think that they're not that sort of granular, and they're thinking about how to approach Africa. It's one prescription for Eastern Europe, China, India, and South America, a completely different prescription for Africa, and it's basically the aid prescription. The second thing I don't like is that as we know, the celebrity culture has basically become the face of Africa. And I believe that that's an artifact of the aid model. What do I mean by that? I mean that African governments have basically many of them have taken a step back. If I asked your audience to name 3 African presidents, they would struggle. And I would imagine. And also, more importantly, if I said, what is their economic philosophy, what is their plan for getting Africa out of this rut, I'm pretty sure that nobody will be able to articulate the view of any one African president. And that's at the heart of the matter. And yet, we have a celebrity culture where celebrities are able to garner attention and articulate a view about Africa and Africans that they have not been elected to do. And I ask myself, as a Zambian, where's the Zambian leadership? Where's the African leadership on this? I would actually prefer that they stand up and say, yes, we need more aid, but at least it will be a view. But for them to be radio silent on the global stage is worrying. The last thing I'll say about the celebrity culture and the media is that it's completely grounded in negativity. Which investor is going to want to rush into an economy to invest when it's always portrayed, as you said earlier, the four horsemen of Africa? It's a negative place. It seems to be a basket case. Nobody wants to invest in that type of an environment.
Depuis 2002 est née l'Union africaine. Et elle devient de plus en plus la voix de l'Afrique. Est-ce que vous ne pensez pas que la solution au développement de l'Afrique doit venir de l'unité de l'Afrique?
The situation is as follows. I'll give you a specific example. I was in Rwanda in February. I went from Rwanda to Kenya to Tanzania. I needed to change, I needed 3 visas, and I needed to change my currency 3 times. That kind of a system is ridiculous. My country is Zambia. It's got about 10 million people. Southern Africa is 200 million people. Obviously, it's much more important for our leaders to think about the continent in a much more regional framework. I hesitate to recommend that because I think there's a real risk that we get caught up with the bureaucracy of, a unified Africa and the vision of a Pan-African state, rather than really understanding what the economic implications or possibilities are. So I would rather have the discussion about why would it be the case that going from Rwanda, Kenya, and Tanzania, which are right next door to each other, why is it a situation that we think it's okay to have 3 visas for these countries and to not having one currency? Again, Rwanda is 10 million people, so it's relatively small. It would do much better to be integrated with the rest of with Eastern Europe. East Africa. I would hazard to guess.
I am a little disturbed when we discuss Africa as in the way that Americans do, for instance. I think it would serve us well sometimes to make distinctions between countries. To say that, for instance, Zambia has done this, has done that, and Somalia has not done it, or Botswana has. I think sometimes it's better for us not to talk about Africa at the continental level. We should talk about individual countries. It doesn't help us come to grip with the problem sometimes if we make it so big.
On your first point about conflating these African countries as one, yes, I think that would be nice. But again, I point and I talk about this in the book, that they're not the same. Obviously, Zambia, previously British rule, under British rule, English-speaking Christian, is very different from Senegal, which is Francophone history, mainly Muslim, and so on. Clearly, there are differences historically. There are differences in the way countries are made up. Kenya, coffee, tea. DRC, minerals. Absolutely, and that's in the book. However, there are common threads that bind us together. And in the book, I call them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which I've touched on already. And unfortunately, whether we like it or not, we are viewed in that light. So I think that to get readers to get their heads around understanding this continent, I think we're broadly right, because in general, many African countries rely on aid. In general, many African countries are poor. In general, most of these governments have bad governance, very bad policy making going on, and so on and so forth. So yes, I take your point in the detail, but I think there's no good way to kind of to get your head around that.
Can I just, what sort of continental-wide policy are we going to design?
My book is
the abandonment of aid, of official aid. Absolutely. That's a policy for the whole continent.
I don't see the Asians have done it.
Each country designs its own policy,
which I think is an unfortunate thing. I think they should have much more regional approach to development, and I think that we'll have much more success.
Which we do, by the way. I think a lot of countries have gone a long way towards that.
In which, like for example,
integration is happening at the banking level. It's happening at the cell phone level. It's happening at the visa level.
How do you mean? Like where? Could you give me some examples? Can you give me some examples?
I'll give you an example. The Southern African Power Pool.
Mm-hmm.
That's integration.
But can you explain what that means exactly?
The countries share electricity when they need to. Zambia
cannot provide electricity to itself.
Well, they are going to export electricity. They've always exported. It depends on the demand.
There's load shedding going on in Zambia.
I just spoke to my sister yesterday.
My parents live there.
Yes. The point is that there are areas where integration is happening.
Well, maybe I should intervene here that because we want other people to contribute, obviously. Nigeria also exports electricity and doesn't have electricity, by the way. It's part of the African contradiction.
Yeah, but the United States issues bonds today. Yeah. We don't have any money.
So, but let me just come back to one quick question to you as you're addressing these issues, which has to do with, you were talking about aid as something that, for example, you're talking about capitalism and the fact that it's best, free market is the best. And you have not addressed an issue which came out in the American intervention as the economy collapsed, or near collapse. It's the fact that Americans are aiding their own companies. They are aiding their own people. Mm-hmm. Whereas our Western trained intellectuals tell us that the idea of aid, subsidy, anything that the government can give to its people is bad. Mm-hmm. Whereas America does. America helps its poor, they help their homeless people, they support and subsidize their airline industry, they support their banks, and they support, the American system can almost be called a socialist system because it supports every person is weak, every institution that is weak gets support. But when we preach to Africans, especially those of us who are trained in Ivy League schools, we say, well, get rid of any form of support for the rich because that is why we are in this situation. why is anybody not talking about the truth about America's own socialism?
No, I think they are. I think this is, I mean, I've only been here a week, and it's definitely under fire. I mean, certainly with the announcement yesterday about the auto industry, I think that's precisely what people are debating. And actually, I think if Africa sustain or subsidized its own industries, that would be a different conversation than Africans relying on other people to provide money for Africans to subsidize, which is essentially what's happening right now. I think the other thing that's really important is let's understand the difference between bailout support and long-term open-ended commitments. Africa suffers from long-term open-ended commitments of aid. There's no illusion in the minds of many African policymakers that aid is viewed as a permanent income. There's no idea that they're actually going to wean themselves off. They're not looking for other ways of financing. They're not looking for other ways to solve problems. The examples that you've given in the United States context, or even at the macro context of governments, places like Eastern Europe, they're also getting bailout packages. Yes, they're suffering from balance of payment crises. Yes, they're suffering from currency crises. But everybody understands that this is a temporary, finite intervention, short, sharp, finite. Go in, solve the problem. Everyone expects that after the credit crisis is resolved, Eastern Europe will continue on a path of providing jobs to its people and reducing poverty. That is not the same situation.
One other question is, you asked for countries in Africa to be rated.
Yes.
Even Americans no longer trust Mad Money on CNBC because the guy misled every investor in this country claiming that stock. How can we trust the rating companies or the rating agencies who are based in the West, who essentially close their eyes to all the crises in the US, lied about statistics, figures, and how do we trust that when they rate us, the rating is good for us and not just good for these private capitals or people who want to come and be the new neo-colonial leaders in Africa? For example, I give you the example of Madoff. If Madoff can lay his hand on 5 African countries, he'll rape the place. But Madoff was able to operate under the radar in this city, New York City, and in this country, the US, for several years and made away with $50 billion or more. Now you're asking us to go back to the kind of guys who work with Madoff and didn't allow him to be detected in this your new capital intervention, that is using private capital, bond rating and all that.
We have 2 choices as Africans. We can either continue to take out a begging bowl and hope that we'll get some kind of a largesse, or we can try to find a way to deliver jobs. How we do that, my preference is the model that I've prescribed in the book. However, there is no illusion that needs work as well. I'm not saying take it as it is. I'm saying this model also has issues. Clearly, being in the middle of a credit crisis, which regulation has shown is required and it's important, is the message we should take away from this. It's not to say that the fundamental core values that I said earlier for over 300 years has delivered jobs should be thrown out. Maybe instead of looking at the extreme model of the United States, we should look to China, which again has delivered jobs. It's based on a more capitalistic free market model. Let's see what China has done. What about India? What about Eastern Europe? What about Brazil? Let's see how these countries are doing it, and you will find that by and large, those countries have not adopted an extreme version of free capital markets, nor have they adopted an aid-based model. So that, to me, is what we should be talking about.
Okay, we'll just take one more question, please.
I have a question. It's Mohammed Keita with the Committee to Protect Journalists. You advocated for the Chinese model. Now, one of the criticism of that model in places like Angola or the DRC is that the Chinese essentially fly in their workers and do all these wonderful construction projects, but at the end of the day, the local workers, the local labor force doesn't really get any benefit. I mean, they don't get trained, there's no transfer of skills, so that when the Chinese actually leave, who's going to be maintaining the roads? So how do you respond to that?
I always ask myself, whose job is it to regulate the environment, to make sure that when the Chinese come to Africa, Africans are benefiting? And to me, that responsibility lays firmly and squarely in the hands of the African governments. Very much like coming to America. If I want to invest in America, the American government is responsible for the regulatory framework. But the question is, why is it that African governments think it's okay for the Chinese to come in and fly in, because remember, these Chinese people need visas. When they actually fly into Zambia or whichever country, they arrive at the airport or on the coast, they must be going through some form of immigration. Who is it who thinks that it's okay for them to come in with all these workers and not employ Africans? And more importantly, if it is the African governments, which I believe it is, who allows that, what is it that we have to do to make African governments incentivized to say, hang on, Mr. China, we like your money, we like the idea that you're investing and building infrastructure, but you just can't come in here, you can't waltz in and out. We also need Africans to benefit. Let's have a discussion about making sure that Africa gets something out of it. You know, we should, as a society, ask our governments, what are you doing for me? What is the government doing for me? Is it right for Africans to live in a society where education is provided by UNICEF, healthcare is provided by Gates Foundation, infrastructure is provided by the Chinese, security is provided by the UN? What are the African governments doing in this type of an environment? We need to hold our governments accountable. They should deliver. There has been progress. You know, as I said, there are 15 stock markets in Africa now. There has been some movement, but I don't want to hear any more, complaining about needing more aid. I want to hear a plan. Africa has got a lot to offer. You know, just as the last comment about going to be able to negotiate, Africa can absolutely tell the Chinese, I know you have 7% arable land, and I know you need to grow crops in my country in order to feed your people. You can come in here, but here are the parameters. You have to have over 80% of the population, or 80% of your workforce has to be Zambian or Kenyan or whatever. Why are we not asking our governments to do that? It's not up to the international community to police China and scold China and say, oh, China's neocolonialism. No, the Africans themselves should make sure that their governments are accountable.
Any political ambitions?
For myself.
Inspirations for
I've done my part. My part is to spur the debate. We all need, we need other Africans to step in as policymakers and politicians.
Oh.
So no.